What if Loki was a Green Ranger? Well, here it is. What's going on? I'm Dylan from Quest for Nostalgia, where I teach how I do all my 3D printed props and cosplays and things like that. And in this video, I'm going to teach you exactly how to make that Loki Ranger. The original art was by Jaegerbomb Design Shop over on Instagram. As soon as that art came out, people were sending me that all the time. And then Mystery Makers 3D took that art and turned it into an amazing STL file. So I had to do this thing. You can go snag that file over on wireframe.com. Comment down below what other mashups you'd like to see. But let's get into the build. So as always, we start with 80 grit. I prefer to use a sanding sponge and wrap 80 grit strips around that to get into it rather than using a power sander. If it's a big project that is really big and open, I will use a power sander, but for the most part, it's just a sponge and then I'll rip that into strips to get into the nice nooks and crannies. After I knock down the initial layer lines with the 80 grit, I then use spot putty and acetone. You can use any putty that you like, U-Pool or Bondo. I use both, but on this one I started with U-Pool. I mix it up 1-to-1 with the acetone, and I use a brush that I got from the dollar store, and I paint that in thin layers over top of the entire project. Now that I have everything all nice and coated, it's time for the next step. I then bump it up to 120 grit. I sand it exactly just like I did with the 80 grit, wrapping it around a big sponge and then ripping up into small pieces to get into those tight spots. If you like the content, hit that subscribe button or think about becoming a Patreon member over on patreon.com/questfornostalgia. Now it's time for filler primer. You can use any brand that you can get your hands on. They're all very good and they're all going to help fill in those layer lines. After I have that filler primer on there, I look at it and see if there's any other troublesome areas that have layer lines still. I'll either do small spots of putty or do another thin coat of putty over the whole thing like I did in this helmet. And as you can see, I'm using Bondo this time, not U-Pool, and it's okay to use either one. Now it's time for 220 grit, and you can do this wet or dry. For this project, I started sanding 220 dry, and then I actually did a second layer of filler primer, which I don't do often, but this one had a lot of gold, so I wanted to make sure it was really smooth for those metallics. After that layer of filler, I did 220 again, but this time I did it wet, and I have a bucket set up in my garage where I can just kind of hunch over, get it all wet, and then go through and wet sand. After the 220 was done, I then used 320 grit wet sanding as well. And then after the 320 was done, I then went immediately into 400 grit after that. Now that all the sanding is done, it's time for primer. I use a flat gray primer by Rust-Oleum just to get an even color over all of the project. With the flat gray on and it's looking smooth, it's time for meadow green. Let the green cure for 24 hours, maybe even a little bit more because we're about to mask. I use 3M automotive masking tape for my masking, and then I also have like a little bit of brown paper that I can do so I don't have to tape the entire helmet. So I masked off all the green, only leaving the gold areas left. And with the masking done, it's time to paint gold. And while I did that, I also painted the mouth silver. Now we have all the colors done for this helmet. So the last step is clear coat, and I use Duplicolor 1K clear coat for this project. I do 2 to 3 coats with that. I'll do a first light mist over everything. I'll let that cure for about 7 to 10 minutes, and then I will do another coat over there where it's a little bit heavier and longer of a spray. For the visor, I make a paper template. You can either put it into the helmet and then trace out where it needs to be, or you can print the visor buck and then put paper over top of that to then be able to cut out the perfect shape. And I just put that over a welding shield because those are usually bigger that can go farther back in helmets like the Green Ranger. I cover the visor in a 5% window tint, or you can buy a pre-tinted one already off Amazon. Then I start with the center and I just hot glue it into place, working my way out. And for the last few steps, I super glued the horns on, I super glued a few magnets on the back there, and this thing is ready to roll. And boom, the glorious Loki Ranger helmet by Mystery Makers 3D. Let me know in the comments below what other mashups you want to see, and make sure to hit that subscribe button so that you can stick around and see which ones I make. As always, thank you to my Patreon members, Balance, Beaver, Thick, Symbiote, David. I really appreciate you all just supporting me making these crazy projects. Check out one of my other videos after this, like my original Green Ranger helmet. As always, I love you guys, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.